Imagine this. It's 1943. You're a German general sitting comfortably in your headquarters, completely confident in your air defense system. Your intelligence reports tell you that the British have some new wooden aircraft. Wooden, you laugh. You actually laugh out loud. Your engineers laughed too. Your top pilots laughed. Even Göring laughed. Nobody is laughing anymore. Because that wooden plane just flew over Berlin at 400 miles per hour, dropped its bombs right on your headquarters, and was back in England before your fighters even got off the ground. And tonight it's going to do it again. And tomorrow night, and the night after that. This is the story of the de Havilland Mosquito, the plane that the German Air Force refused to take seriously, the plane they mocked, dismissed, and completely ignored, and the plane that, as a result, went on to humiliate them at every single turn. Stick with me here, because this story has everything. Arrogant commanders are making catastrophic mistakes. Genius engineers are solving impossible problems. Pilots are pulling off missions so insane they sound made up. And there is one aircraft, made almost entirely out of wood and glue, that somehow became the most feared plane in the sky. Let's start at the very beginning. It's 1938. The world is on the edge of another massive war, and Britain knows it. The Royal Air Force is desperately trying to modernize and determine what kind of aircraft it'll need to fight the Germans. And the debate within the RAF is brutal, political, and full of disagreement. Most of the brass want big bombers, heavy bombers, four-engine monsters that can carry enormous bomb loads and pound the enemy into dust. That's the fashionable thinking at the time. Strategic bombing. You build giant planes, you drop giant bombs, you destroy the enemy's factories and cities and infrastructure, and you win the war without ever having to fight on the ground. Sounds great on paper. But there's one man at the de Havilland Aircraft Company named Geoffrey de Havilland who has a completely different idea. De Havilland looks at the situation and thinks, what if instead of building a plane that carries a huge bomb load, we build a plane so incredibly fast it doesn't need any defensive guns at all? What if we build a plane that can simply outrun any fighter that tries to intercept it? This idea sounds almost too simple, but de Havilland is serious. He and his chief designer Ronald Bishop start crunching the numbers, and what they find is fascinating. Every gun turret on a bomber weighs hundreds of pounds. Every gunner you put on the plane weighs more. All the armor protecting those gunners weighs more still. The ammunition, the mechanisms, the hardware, all of it adds weight. And weight means you need a bigger engine. And a bigger engine means more weight. It's a vicious cycle. But what if you just stripped all of that away? What if you built the smallest possible aircraft with the most powerful possible engines and just made it go stupidly fast? De Havilland goes further. What if, to save even more weight and to save precious aluminium that Britain desperately needs for other aircraft, we built this plane out of wood? Now at this point in history, wood sounds like a step backward. The future is metal, everyone knows that. Metal is strong, metal is modern, metal is what serious military aircraft are made of. Wood is for old biplanes and hobbyists. Wood is embarrassing. The RAF thinks this is a ridiculous idea. They reject the proposal. De Havilland keeps going anyway. Here's why the wood idea is actually brilliant, and this is something that gets lost in the telling of this story. Britain in 1938 and 1939 is gearing up for war, and the supply of aluminium is going to be incredibly strained. Every pound of aluminium goes toward the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the Lancaster. These planes absolutely must be built. Britain simply cannot afford to build a brand new experimental aircraft out of precious metals that are needed elsewhere. But wood, Britain has plenty of wood. Britain has furniture makers, cabinet makers, craftsmen, and specialized joiners who have been working with wood their whole lives. These people can't build metal aircraft, but they absolutely can build something wooden. The entire skilled workforce that would otherwise sit idle during the war can be put to work on this plane. And here's the other thing about wood that nobody talks about. When built correctly, a wooden aircraft is not weak, not at all. The Mosquito used a special construction technique with a sandwich of balsa wood between sheets of plywood, bonded together with a new synthetic glue developed by the de Havilland company itself. The result is what engineers call a monocoque structure, where the skin of the aircraft itself carries the structural load. This thing was light, and it was extraordinarily strong. De Havilland pitches the idea again to the Air Ministry in 1939. They reject it aga. He keeps going. He starts building a prototype at his own company's expense, with no government contract, no guaranteed order, nothing. Just his team believes in the idea and is working on it. In November 1940, the Mosquito prototype took to the air for the first time. And it is incredible. The test pilot, Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the founder's own son, pushes the prototype to its limits on the first real high-speed runs, and the numbers that come back are almost unbelievable. This aircraft, this wooden plane that everyone had laughed at and rejected, is faster than any operational fighter in the Royal Air Force. Faster than the Hurricane, faster than the Spitfire. In some configurations, it could hit 380, 390, or even 400 miles per hour, and those numbers would keep climbing as the design was refined. The RAF, suddenly very interested, places an order, but here's where it gets complicated, because the RAF isn't quite sure what it wants to do with this thing. It's fast, yes, but what is it for? And this is actually one of the remarkable things about the Mosquito. Over the course of the war, it becomes so many different things to so many different people that it's almost hard to believe we are talking about the same aircraft. There's the photographic reconnaissance version. Because the plane can fly so fast and so high, it can cruise over occupied Europe taking photographs without any fighter catching it. Intelligence officers love this. They get crystal clear pictures of German factories, airfields, ports, troop movements, all without risking a fight. Then there's the light bomber version. This is the one we're going to spend a lot of time on. The Mosquito can carry 4 500-pound bombs internally in a bay that sits in the fuselage. And because it's so fast, it can hit targets in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, deep into Germany, drop its bombs, and be gone before the Germans can mount a serious response. Then there's the night fighter version. Equipped with radar, bristling with cannons and machine guns in the nose, the Mosquito night fighter becomes an absolute menace to German bombers flying over Britain at night. This version ends the Blitz as an effective strategy. Then there's the long-range fighter, the escort fighter, the anti-shipping strike aircraft, the Pathfinder aircraft that flies ahead of bomber formations and marks targets with flares, the Banff strike wing version that hunts German shipping in the North Sea, the version that carries a 57mm cannon, which is a naval gun literally stuffed into the nose of the aircraft to attack U-boats and surface ships. The Mosquito is not one plane. It is somehow a dozen planes wearing the same skin. And the Germans have no idea what to do about any of it. Let's talk about the German response, or rather, the German lack of response, because this is where the story gets fascinating and honestly a little painful to watch. Hermann Göring is in charge of the Luftwaffe. He is a World War I ace, a personal friend and loyalist of Adolf Hitler, and a man of truly spectacular overconfidence. Göring has convinced himself and done his best to convince everyone around him that German air power is invincible. The Luftwaffe smashed Poland. It smashed France. It smashed the Low Countries. How could anyone possibly challenge it? When intelligence reports about the Mosquito start coming in, the reaction inside the Luftwaffe's high command is almost perfectly calibrated to be wrong. The first response is dismissal. A wooden aircraft, built by a furniture company, this is clearly not a serious threat. German engineers are building the most advanced aircraft in the world. The Focke-Wulf 190, the Messerschmitt 109, the Heinkel 219. These are precision metal machines. A wood and glue construction is laughably primitive by comparison. The second response, once the dismissal starts getting harder to maintain because the Mosquito keeps showing up over German territory and there's nothing they can do about it, is frustration. Göring reportedly said, and this quote has been repeated so many times it's become almost legendary, that when he heard the British were building aircraft out of wood, he wept. Because Germany, the great industrial nation, with all its steel and aluminium and precision engineering, couldn't match what the British were doing with a bunch of carpenters. The third response is a scramble to build something comparable. The Germans start development of what they call the Volksjäger, or People's Fighter, the Heinkel 162, a jet-powered aircraft that they try to build quickly and cheaply. But this is late in the war, and the resources, the skilled workers, the factories, everything is getting bombed and overwhelmed, and it's too little too late. But here's the critical thing. The Germans don't just fail to build a competitor to the Mosquito. They fail to take the threat seriously early enough to develop proper defenses against it, and that failure costs them enormously. Let me tell you about some of the missions the Mosquito flew, because they are genuinely extraordinary. The first one I want to talk about is Operation Jericho. February 18, 1944. Amiens prison in occupied France. The Germans are holding somewhere between 700 and 800 prisoners inside, many of them French resistance members, men and women who have been captured by the Gestapo and are either waiting to be executed or waiting to be sent to concentration camps. The French resistance sends word to Britain. They have intelligence that a mass execution is planned. Can anything be done? What's planned is one of the most precise and daring bombing raids in the history of aviation. 19 Mosquitoes are going to fly low, very low at treetop height to avoid German radar. They're going to cross the English Channel in winter weather. They're going to find this specific prison in a specific town, and they're going to drop their bombs in a way that destroys the outer walls of the prison and the guards' quarters inside, without, as much as humanly possible, killing the prisoners they're trying to free. Think about what you're asking these pilots to do. They need to calculate the exact angle of approach, the exact speed, and the exact altitude so that their 500-pound bombs skip along the ground, hit the walls, and detonate in exactly the right places. A few feet off in any direction, and they kill the very people they came to save. The weather on the day of the mission is terrible, visibility is poor, the target is small, the whole thing could easily be called off. They go anyway. The lead aircraft, flown by Group Captain Percy Pickard, one of the most decorated and experienced airmen in the RAF, makes the first attack. His bombs hit the outer wall and the eastern end of the building. The walls collapse. More aircraft follow, attacking the guards' quarters. Pickard's aircraft is shot down on the way home. He and his navigator are both killed. He gave his life for this mission. Somewhere between 258 and 400 prisoners escape through the breached walls. Many are recaptured, but many are not. Many people who would have been shot or sent to the camps walk out through those holes in the wall and disappear into the French countryside. Operation Jericho is to this day considered one of the most remarkable precision strikes ever carried out by aircraft. But that's not the only mission that makes your jaw drop. Let me tell you about the Mosquito raids on Oslo. September 25, 1942. 6 Mosquitoes fly from RAF Luchars in Scotland, cross the North Sea, fly low over Norway, and attack the Gestapo headquarters at Victoria Terrasse in Oslo. The Gestapo has been using this building to interrogate and torture Norwegian resistance members. The attack is low and fast. The bombs go through the windows. The building burns. Gestapo files, prisoner records, informant lists, all of it destroyed. The German response, absolute fury, paralyzing fury, because there is absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. The Mosquitoes came out of nowhere, hit the target, and were gone. This pattern repeats itself again and again throughout the war. The Mosquito appears where it isn't expected, does exactly what it came to do, and disappears before anyone can mount a proper response. The Shellhouse raid in Copenhagen, March 21, 1945. This is late in the war, but it shows how the Mosquito was still being used right to the very end. The Gestapo is using the Shellhouse building in central Copenhagen as its headquarters. Inside, they're holding Danish resistance prisoners on the top floor, specifically to use them as human shields against exactly the kind of attack that's being planned. The building also contains vast amounts of intelligence about the Danish resistance, records that, if captured, would allow the Germans to round up and execute hundreds more people. The challenge is obvious. The building is in the middle of a city. The prisoners are on the top floor. You cannot simply bomb the building. You need to hit the lower floors, destroy the German intelligence records and infrastructure, and leave the top floor intact enough for the prisoners to survive. 18 Mosquitoes make the attack. The lead aircraft, flown by Wing Commander Bob Bateson, comes in so low that he has to bank his wings to avoid the lampposts on the approach. His navigator, Les Sismore, one of the finest navigators in the RAF, guides them in with precise accuracy. The bombs hit exactly where they're aimed. The lower floors are destroyed. Several prisoners escape from the wreckage of the upper floors. Not everything goes perfectly. One aircraft, tragically, crashes into a school. Children are killed. It's one of the darkest moments associated with the Mosquito's operational history, and it's important not to romanticize what war actually is. These missions were not clean. People died, including civilians, including the Mosquito crews themselves. But the mission achieves its objective. The Gestapo records in Copenhagen are largely destroyed. The resistance network is not rolled up. The war ended 3 months later. Now let's talk about the bombing campaign, because this is where the Mosquito really starts to grind the Luftwaffe down in a very particular and devastating way. Bomber Command, under Air Marshal Arthur Harris, is conducting a massive strategic bombing campaign against Germany. The heavy bombers, the Lancasters and the Halifaxes, fly at night to try to avoid German fighters. They carry enormous bomb loads. They suffer absolutely horrific casualties. The problem is that German night fighters, guided by radar, have gotten very good at intercepting and destroying British bombers. Entire squadrons are being wiped out. The loss rates are reaching a point where the campaign is starting to become almost unsustainable. Harris needs something to help. He needs aircraft that can fly ahead of the main bomber stream, find the targets, mark them, disrupt German defenses, confuse German radar, and generally make the job of the night fighters harder. Enter the Mosquito. The Pathfinder force, led by Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett, uses Mosquitoes to race ahead of the bomber stream. They fly faster than any German fighter that tries to intercept them. They reach the target first. They drop target indicators, colored flares that the following heavies aim their bombs at. They dramatically improve bombing accuracy. But the Mosquito doesn't just mark targets. It starts flying its own independent campaign against Germany. The Light Night Striking Force, as it becomes known, builds up to where, on some nights, over 100 Mosquitoes are flying missions against German cities simultaneously. The math here is important. A Lancaster carries a bomb load of around 14,000 pounds and needs a crew of 7 men to fly it. A Mosquito carries around 4,000 pounds of bombs and needs a crew of 2. So you need maybe 3 or 4 Mosquito sorties to equal 1 Lancaster's bomb load. But in terms of the resources required, the fuel, the maintenance, the aircrew trained and risked, the Mosquito is in many ways more efficient. And crucially, the Mosquito loss rate is a fraction of the Lancasters. While heavy bombers during the worst periods of the campaign were suffering loss rates of 5, 6, or even 7% per mission, which statistically meant that a crew had only a small chance of surviving their tour of duty, Mosquito loss rates were often below 1%. This matters enormously for morale and for sustainability. You can keep flying Mosquito operations when you simply cannot afford to keep sending Lancasters into the same kind of opposition. The Germans know this. They know the Mosquito is a problem. They keep trying to come up with an answer. Here's the thing about the German attempts to counter the Mosquito. They're a story of repeated failure, and that failure tells you something important about why Germany eventually lost the air war. The obvious counter is to build a fighter fast enough to catch the Mosquito. In theory, the Germans have the technology to do this. The Focke-Wulf 190D, with a longer-nosed version using a liquid-cooled engine, is fast enough to potentially match the Mosquito at certain altitudes. The Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter is definitely fast enough. But these aircraft arrive late, in limited numbers, and the infrastructure to deploy them effectively is crumbling under the Allied bombing campaign. The German night fighter force, which is the main defensive tool against the RAF's night bombing campaign, has aircraft like the Heinkel 219 and the Junkers 88. These are capable planes, but they have a fundamental problem. They're too slow to reliably catch a Mosquito that's flying flat out. In one particularly humiliating series of incidents, German night fighters are scrambled to intercept Mosquitoes, get visual contact, push their throttles to maximum, and watch helplessly as the wooden British aircraft simply accelerates away from them and disappears into the darkness. This happens repeatedly. German pilots file report after report saying essentially the same thing. We can see it, we cannot catch it, we cannot engage it, it just goes faster. And then the Mosquito starts doing something even more infuriating. The RAF equips Mosquitoes with special equipment to detect German radar transmissions. When a Mosquito crew picks up a German radar signal, they know a night fighter is trying to find them. They take evasive action. They jam the radar. They confuse the operators. The whole carefully built German night defense system starts looking for British bombers and finding nothing. Meanwhile, other Mosquitoes are carrying out a campaign that specifically targets the German night fighter system itself. They fly patrols near German airfields. When a German night fighter takes off, the Mosquito follows it. When the German fighter is trying to land, low on fuel, coming in on its approach, the Mosquito strikes. The tactic is called Intruder missions, and it is devastatingly effective. German night fighter crews start dreading their own airfields. You're flying home after a mission. You're tired. You're low on fuel. You need to land. And somewhere in the darkness, there might be a Mosquito waiting for exactly this moment. The effect on morale is significant. German night fighter commanders report that their crews are increasingly reluctant to fly, not because they're cowards, these are experienced combat veterans, but because the odds are becoming genuinely impossible. You go up, and you can't find the British bombers. You come home, and something might shoot you down over your own airfield. What exactly are you supposed to do? Let's talk about some of the specific moments where the Mosquito humiliated the Luftwaffe in ways that were deeply, publicly embarrassing. The Berlin raids. Berlin is the capital of the Third Reich. It is heavily defended. It has some of the densest concentrations of anti-aircraft guns in the world. It has ring after ring of searchlight batteries. It has multiple Luftwaffe fighter wings specifically tasked with its defense. And the Mosquito raids it, repeatedly, sometimes nightly. Not just raids it precisely and pointedly at moments calculated to cause maximum psychological and political damage. January 30th, 1943, Hermann Göring is scheduled to give a major speech to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Nazis coming to power. The speech is being broadcast on German radio. Millions of Germans are listening. Göring begins speaking. The air raid sirens go off. Mosquitoes are over Berlin. Göring has to stop his speech. He has to take cover. The radio broadcast goes off the air. When the all-clear sounds, he comes back and tries to continue, but the damage is done. The Reichsminister of the Luftwaffe has just had his big, triumphant speech interrupted by the very aircraft his air force was supposed to stop. A few hours later, Joseph Goebbels is scheduled to give his own speech as part of the same celebrations. The sirens go off again. More Mosquitoes. Goebbels can't give his speech either. The propaganda implications of this are massive. These speeches are supposed to celebrate German strength and invincibility. Instead, German civilians listening to the radio hear air raid sirens. They know their capital city is being bombed. On a day of triumph, the message that the Nazi leadership was trying to send gets completely overwhelmed by the message that the RAF is sending instead. And here's the thing, the Mosquito crews doing this know exactly what they're doing. This isn't accidental timing. The planners knew about the speeches. They planned the raids specifically for this day and specifically for this time. Let me tell you about the men who flew these missions, because they deserve more than just being footnotes in a story about an aircraft. The Mosquito crews were two people, a pilot and a navigator. Sometimes the navigator also served as a bomb aimer or a radio operator. They sat side by side in a cockpit that was cramped and sometimes brutally cold at altitude. They flew into the heart of the most heavily defended airspace in Europe, regularly, on purpose. The casualty rates, while lower than those of the heavy bombers, were still real. Men died. The aircraft didn't come home. Families waited for news that never came with the right words in it. There were Canadian crews, Australian crews, New Zealand crews, South African crews, and Norwegian crews who had escaped the occupation of their country and were now flying back over it. There were Polish crews whose entire country had been destroyed by the Germans and who had particular reasons to be highly motivated. There were American crews who served with the RAF before the United States entered the war. There were crews of almost every nationality you can think of. What they shared was a level of skill that was exceptional even by the standards of an air force at war. Flying a Mosquito required real ability. It was a fast, demanding aircraft that did not forgive mistakes. The engines were powerful and could be temperamental. The aircraft was very sensitive to the controls. At the low level, the margins for error were measured in feet and fractions of seconds. The navigators especially deserve recognition, because navigation in 1943 and 1944 was not what navigation is today. There was no GPS. There were no satellites. You navigated by map, by compass, by looking at the ground, by calculating your speed and heading and how long you'd been flying, and figuring out where that meant you were. At night, in bad weather, while enemy radar operators were trying to find you, and enemy fighters were trying to shoot you down. Getting the right target at the right time was a miracle of human skill, concentration, and preparation. The men who could do it reliably were extraordinary. Group Captain John Searby, Wing Commander Pat Daniels, Squadron Leader Ian Spencer. These are names that deserve to be remembered. And the aces. The Mosquito produced some remarkable fighter aces, men like Wing Commander Bransom Burbridge, who flew night fighter Mosquitoes and became the top-scoring night fighter ace in the RAF with 21 victories. Men like Wing Commander Roderick Kisham and his navigator George Stainer, who worked together with such precision that their kill count seemed almost unreal. These weren't just skilled pilots and navigators. They were people operating at the absolute edge of human capability, night after night, in conditions that would seem impossible to most of us. Let's go back to the technical side for a moment, because the Mosquito kept evolving throughout the war, and each new version was more capable than the last. The original Mosquito B Mk IV bomber could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs internally. Then the designers figured out how to modify the bomb bay to carry a 4,000-pound cookie, which was the RAF's heavy blast bomb, the one they called the Blockbuster. Now one Mosquito is carrying the same bomb as the early Lancasters were managing. The engines keep getting upgraded. The original Merlin 21 engines give way to the Merlin 25, then to the Merlin 76, each version more powerful than the last. The speed keeps climbing, the ceiling keeps going up. At high altitude, in the photographic reconnaissance role, Mosquitoes are operating above 40,000 feet, heights where German interceptors struggle to reach, and where the pilots are relying on their heated flight suits and their oxygen masks just to stay conscious. Then there's the Mark XVI, which introduces a pressurized cockpit. Now the crews can operate at extreme altitude in something approaching comfort, cruising at 43,000 feet, where the thin air makes interception almost impossible. By the end of the war, the Mosquito was so capable that the RAF was using it for missions that would have seemed impossible in 1940, flying from Britain to targets deep in Norway and back, flying from Malta to targets in Eastern Europe, flying from the Pacific Theater against Japanese targets. The Japanese, incidentally, have the same problem with the Mosquito that the Germans do. Their fighters can't catch it. They try, they fail. The Mosquito flies over, does what it came to do and leaves. The Wooden Wonder, as it's been called, turns out to be adaptable, capable, and almost impossibly useful across almost every role you can ask of an aircraft. By 1944 and 1945, the effect of the Mosquito campaign on German air defense was cumulative, and it was devastating. Think about what the Germans are dealing with. Every night, hundreds of heavy bombers are attacking German cities. Ahead of them, faster and harder to catch, are the Mosquito Pathfinders marking the targets. Around the heavy bombers, Mosquito night fighters are protecting them from German interceptors. After the bombers leave, Mosquito intruders are prowling around German night fighter bases, waiting for exhausted German crews to come home. The German night fighter force, which had been one of the most effective defensive organizations in the war, is being worn down from every direction simultaneously. And in the daytime, Mosquitoes are hitting specific high-value targets with precision that the heavy bombers can't match. Power stations, railway marshalling yards, specific buildings in specific cities. Each target was carefully chosen to cause maximum disruption to the German war machine. The German radar system, which coordinates the night fighter response, keeps getting jammed, deceived, and overwhelmed. The German anti-aircraft batteries, the famous flak that kills so many Allied airmen, cannot effectively engage a Mosquito flying fast and low, because by the time the guns are laid, the aircraft has moved on. The economics of the whole thing are working badly against Germany. Building and maintaining a flak gun requires enormous resources. Building and maintaining a night fighter and training a crew to fly it requires enormous resources. And these resources are being deployed against an enemy that is simultaneously almost impossible to hit, highly effective at its missions, and able to sustain its operations at relatively low cost. There's a particular story I want to tell that captures the relationship between the Mosquito and the Luftwaffe perfectly. It involves a place called Peenemünde. Peenemünde is on the Baltic coast. It's where the Germans are developing their secret weapons, the V-1 flying bomb, the V-2 rocket. These weapons, if deployed in large numbers, could genuinely change the course of the war. The V-2, especially, is completely unstoppable once it's launched. Nothing can shoot it down. Allied intelligence knows about Peenemünde and knows it has to be destroyed. The problem is that Peenemünde is well north, well away from the normal bomber routes, and well defended. Sending the heavies there in normal numbers in the normal way might not work, and the Germans would know an attack was coming because they've broken enough Allied codes to sometimes predict where raids are going. So the Allies use a ruse. On the night of August 17, 1943, the main bombing force went to Peenemünde, but at the same time, a force of Mosquitoes files straight for Berlin. The German night fighter controllers look at their radar screens and they see two things. A large formation is going north, and Mosquitoes are heading for Berlin. They make their choice. They sent the night fighters to defend Berlin. The Mosquitoes bomb Berlin. They're doing their job. They're also doing something else. They're keeping the German night fighters away from Peenemünde. The heavy bombers hit Peenemünde. The German night fighters, racing back from Berlin to try to intercept, arrive too late. The damage to Peenemünde is significant. The V-weapon program is set back by months that give the Allied armies time to prepare for the invasion of France, which will eventually end the war. A wooden aircraft and its two-man crew flying into Berlin to drop some bombs and draw away the fighters. That simple act might have saved thousands of lives, might have shortened the war. That's the Mosquito. The final chapter of the Mosquito's story in the war is something close to absolute dominance. By late 1944, the light night striking force was flying sometimes 200 sorties in a single night against German targets. The Germans are essentially powerless to stop this. Their fuel is running out. Their best pilots are dead or exhausted. Their factories are being bombed. Their radar network is compromised. Their night fighters are flying missions with increasingly poor odds of survival. The last months of the bombing campaign saw Mosquitoes flying almost with impunity over Germany. The aircraft that was laughed at, that was built out of wood and glue, that had no guns on the bomber versions and was supposed to be vulnerable, is now one of the most feared presences in the night sky over the Reich. Göring, in one of his increasingly unhinged moments later in the war, blames the Mosquito for all sorts of problems. He's not entirely wrong. The Mosquito has been a problem for the Luftwaffe since the moment it flew its first operational mission. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe is over. In the Pacific, Mosquitoes are still flying against Japan. They will continue to do so until the Japanese surrender in August. When the final accounting is done, the Mosquito's record is almost incomprehensible. It flew reconnaissance missions that provided intelligence that was critical to the planning of every major Allied operation. It flew bomber missions that destroyed or damaged targets across occupied Europe. It flew night fighter missions that protected countless Allied bombers. It flew anti-shipping missions that sank German and Japanese vessels. It flew Intruder missions that wore down the Luftwaffe night fighter force. It flew special operations missions that rescued prisoners, destroyed headquarters, and disrupted communications. More Mosquitoes were built during the war than almost any other Allied aircraft except the Spitfire and the Hurricane. Over 7,700 aircraft in total built in Britain, Canada, and Australia. The loss rate, at 0.5% of all sorties, is the lowest of any bomber command aircraft of the war. So what's the lesson here? What does the story of the Mosquito actually teach us? The first lesson is about assumptions. The Germans assumed that wooden construction meant primitive and weak. They were wrong. The British Air Ministry assumed that an unarmed aircraft couldn't survive. They were wrong. Everyone who looked at the Mosquito on paper and said it wouldn't work was wrong. The people who actually built it and flew it turned out to be right. The second lesson is about flexibility. The Mosquito worked so well partly because it wasn't designed to do just one thing. It was designed to be fast and adaptable. As the war changed and new problems emerged, the Mosquito found new ways to be useful. The rigid thinking that said aircraft must carry guns, aircraft must have big crews, and aircraft must be metal, all of that thinking kept people from seeing the possibilities. The third lesson is about what happens when you underestimate your enemy. The Luftwaffe command knew the Mosquito was a problem relatively early. They knew it was faster than their interceptors. They knew it was hard to catch and harder to stop. And they still didn't treat it with the seriousness it deserved. They kept telling themselves they would develop a counter. They kept dismissing it. And while they were dismissing it, it was destroying their infrastructure, degrading their defenses, wearing down their crews, and helping to win the war. Underestimating your opponent, it turns out, is one of the most reliable paths to defeat. The fourth lesson is about ingenuity under constraint. Britain in 1939 and 1940 didn't have unlimited aluminium. It didn't have unlimited skilled metal workers. It was desperate and under enormous pressure. But it had wood, and it had carpenters, and it had one engineer who looked at those constraints and saw an opportunity instead of a limitation. The Mosquito is what you can build when necessity forces you to think differently. There's one more thing I want to say about the Mosquito. We talk a lot about the big aircraft of the Second World War, the Lancaster, the B-17, the P-51 Mustang. These are iconic. They deserve their reputation. But the Mosquito is different. The Mosquito is the aircraft that the establishment didn't believe in. The aircraft that was built anyway by people who knew in their gut that it was right. The aircraft that proved every skeptic wrong with every mission it flew. It was made out of wood and glue and British stubbornness, and the conviction that speed and ingenuity could be worth more than armor and firepower. It flew 28,000 operational sorties. It served in 13 different marks and variants. It operated on every front in the war. It was feared by the Luftwaffe, feared by the Japanese, and loved by every pilot who ever flew one. Geoffrey de Havilland, who believed in this aircraft when nobody else did, lived to see it win the war. His son, who flew the prototype and helped prove the concept, died testing a later aircraft. The price of pushing the boundaries of what's possible is sometimes very high. But the aircraft he believed in outlived the war. It flew on with many air forces into the 1950s and in some cases the 1960s, long after the Luftwaffe was dissolved and the Reich was in rubble. The wooden wonder, the timber terror, the plane Germany laughed at until it was too late to stop laughing and start worrying. The de Havilland Mosquito. The aircraft that proved, beyond any doubt, that the most dangerous plane in the sky isn't always the biggest or the most heavily armed. Sometimes it's the one that nobody took seriously. Until it was far, far too late.